In the early hours of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine. At first, the world knew almost nothing. There was no immediate public warning, no full admission of disaster, no clear explanation of what had happened inside the plant. But radiation does not obey borders. Within days, invisible traces of the accident were detected beyond the Soviet Union. The evidence spread across Europe, forcing one of the most secretive states on Earth to admit that something terrible had happened. Chernobyl was more than a nuclear accident. It became a symbol of a system under pressure, a disaster that revealed the dangers of political secrecy, flawed technology, and human error inside an empire already beginning to weaken. The plant stood near Pripyat, in what was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Pripyat was a young Soviet city built for workers and their families. Nuclear power was a point of pride. To the Soviet state, it promised modernity and strength. But beneath that confidence were problems that ordinary citizens, and even many plant workers, were not fully allowed to see. Reactor 4 was an RBMK reactor, a Soviet design capable of producing enormous power. But the design had serious weaknesses. Under certain unstable conditions, the reactor could become dangerously difficult to control. On the night of April 25th, operators prepared for a safety test. The goal was to see whether the reactor's turbines could keep electricity flowing long enough to power emergency systems until backup generators came online. The test had been delayed. The reactor was running at low power. Conditions became unstable. It was a chain of flawed decisions, dangerous design features, and a safety culture that failed to confront risk openly. Just after 1:23 in the morning, the reactor surged out of control. Explosions tore through Reactor 4. The core was exposed. Fires broke out. Radioactive material rose into the night sky. The building had not been designed to contain such a catastrophe. Firefighters arrived quickly. They fought flames on the roof and around the damaged reactor in an environment that was already deadly. Inside the plant, workers struggled to understand what had happened. Many could not believe the reactor itself had been destroyed. But outside, the evidence was spreading. Yet for many residents, the morning after the explosion began like any other. Children went outside. Families looked toward the distant plant. Some saw smoke. Few received clear information. On April 27th, roughly a day and a half after the explosion, Pripyat was evacuated. Residents were told to take essential belongings and were led to believe they would return soon. Most never did. Buses carried tens of thousands of people away from a city that would become frozen in time. Apartments remained filled with furniture. Classrooms held books and posters. Playgrounds stood empty. On April 28th, radiation was detected outside the Soviet Union. Investigators in Sweden realized the contamination was not from their plant. The trail pointed east. Only then did the Soviet Union begin to publicly acknowledge that an accident had occurred. The admission was limited, the language was controlled, but the silence had already failed. In the days after the explosion, soldiers, engineers, miners, pilots, scientists, doctors, and emergency workers were sent into the disaster zone. They became known as liquidators. Their work was dangerous and often heroic. They cleared radioactive debris and worked to contain a disaster that could have become worse. Helicopters dropped materials onto the burning reactor. Miners dug beneath the plant amid fears that molten fuel could worsen contamination. Engineers prepared a massive concrete and steel structure to cover the ruins. That structure became known as the sarcophagus. The human cost of Chernobyl is still debated. 2 plant workers died in the immediate aftermath. 134 plant staff developed acute radiation syndrome. 28 died in the following weeks. Later health effects, especially thyroid cancer among those exposed as children, became one of the clearest long-term consequences. Broader estimates vary widely because radiation risk is difficult to measure across large populations over many years. What is not disputed is that Chernobyl displaced communities, damaged trust, and left deep physical and psychological scars. Large areas were contaminated, villages were abandoned, farmland was restricted. Families were relocated from places their ancestors had lived for generations. The disaster changed landscapes, families, and memory. For many, it was the loss of a home they could never safely return to. Chernobyl did not single-handedly cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. The state was already under pressure, but Chernobyl made those weaknesses harder to deny. It showed citizens that the state could fail at the highest level. For Mikhail Gorbachev, it became a test of whether the Soviet system could be honest about its own failures. The answer was painful. Chernobyl was not just the result of a single decision. It was the result of a system where design flaws were concealed and warnings were ignored. The ruined reactor became a monument to the cost of secrecy. Today, Chernobyl remains one of the most infamous disasters in history. Its name evokes abandoned streets, invisible danger, and the limits of human control over powerful technology. The title, "The Disaster That Exposed an Empire," is symbolic. Chernobyl did not destroy the Soviet Union overnight, but it revealed the gap between the image of Soviet power and the reality beneath it. The Soviet Union wanted to project certainty. Chernobyl was not only a nuclear catastrophe, it was a warning about technology without transparency, and a state so committed to appearing unbreakable that it struggled to admit when something had already broken. Fault Lines of History. Like and subscribe if you would like to hear more documentaries about the turning points that changed civilization.